So this brief voiceover PowerPoint is really just going to go over some basic information we need to know about the skin, how it works, what is involved in each of the layers, and how it may be a little bit different in children. And then when we go over things in class, you'll be able to go over more specific conditions that we may experience in the pediatric population. So this is just a brief overview and review for you. So first of all, the epidermis, remember that's the thin outermost layer, and that's the layer that contains the melanin. Again, knowing what layers are comprised of helps us understand when we talk about a skin condition, and when we describe what layers it affects, it'll give us a better understanding of how it may manifest itself in the symptomatology associated with them. The dermis is the next layer, and that has a lot of nerves, muscles, and or muscle connective tissue, hair follicles, sweat glands, blood vessels. That's a big chunk of a lot of stuff, if you will, involved in that layer of the skin. And finally, the subcutaneous layer. That's where our sweat glands are, and fat layers that just provide an insulation. So what we want to think about is those that have very thin or small subcutaneous layers certainly aren't going to maintain heat as well as those who may. There is less of a layer of protection if we don't have that fatty layer available. So what does that mean when it comes to infants? Well, let's think about this. Infants have very thin skin and a very, very much smaller amount of subcutaneous fat. And as I said, when you have those types of things, it really sets you up for a perfect condition in terms of the inability to maintain their own body temperatures. I'm sure you talked a lot about that in the newborn phase when you were with Professor Mulcahy. And again, we are going to reiterate it here. Infants have very thin skin, very little subcutaneous fat. Therefore, they will lose heat very rapidly, and they have a very difficult time regulating their temperature. The skin is also very thin. And the second thing that we need to always think about, because it is different in young infants and young children, is that it causes them to absorb medications much more rapidly and in an increased amount. It can also cause them to absorb some chemicals much more in the volume of absorption, or a much more increased absorption because of that thin skin. The last thing I just want to mention on this particular PowerPoint voiceover is that we are going to talk about different types of skin lesions, and it's important to understand what a primary lesion is versus a secondary lesion. So a primary lesion is something that occurs just in healthy skin that exists. So maybe it's a blister that you may have had, little patches like papules, nodules, wheals that we look for when we have reactions to like a TB test. So little pustules, things like that are considered a primary lesion. A secondary lesion results from changes in the primary lesion. So it's something that happens once the first primary lesion exists. And then we may get some scars or some keloid development, ulcers that may develop in these areas that already have a primary lesion. So two different types of lesions. One is the first primary. Secondary is continued or additional damage that occurs to that primary lesion site.